Morning arrived quietly in many American neighborhoods. The sun rose over tidy streets, touching the tops of houses that looked much like one another. Lawns were trimmed, curtains were drawn back just enough to let the light in. Somewhere, a coffee pot began to hiss. A radio murmured in the background low enough not to disturb the calm. In kitchens across the country, tables were set with simple familiarity. Toast browned in upright metal slots. Cereal bowls waited patiently beside cartons of milk. The smell of eggs and bacon filled the room, comforting and predictable. Parents moved through their routines with practiced ease, glancing occasionally at the clock mounted above the sink. Children buttoned coats, tied shoes, gathered books. There was laughter, sometimes impatience, a reminder not to forget a lunchbox, a kiss on the forehead before stepping out the door. Outside, school buses groaned to life. It was trusted, relied upon, built into the rhythm of life itself. People expected tomorrow to look much like today, and the day after that. They planned meals, birthdays, vacations. They argued over small things. They worried about bills, about health, about children growing too fast. The world, as it appeared from the kitchen window or the classroom door, felt solid, stable, familiar. Life moved forward in small, predictable steps, and that, more than anything else, is how the story begins. For many Americans, normal life was not simply a habit. It was a quiet agreement, an agreement rarely spoken, rarely examined, but deeply felt. The world appeared stable because it needed to appear stable. Ordinary life depended on that appearance. Without it, daily responsibilities would become difficult to sustain. Work would feel uncertain. Planning would feel pointless. Raising children would feel unbearable. So normality carried weight far beyond comfort. It carried reassurance. People moved through their days with an underlying belief that the structures around them were solid, not perfect, but reliable. That schools would open, that roads would remain, that homes would stand where they had always stood. This belief did not come from constant evidence. It came from repetition, from the way yesterday resembled today, and today promised to resemble tomorrow. Repetition created trust. When the same routines unfolded day after day, they suggested continuity. When something continued long enough, it began to feel permanent, and permanence, even when unexamined, provided safety. The predictability of daily life allowed people to direct their attention inward, toward family, work, and community, rather than outward toward larger uncertainties they could not control. In this way, normal life functioned as a buffer. It absorbed anxiety before it could fully form. Institutions played a quiet but essential role in sustaining this sense of security. Schools, churches, workplaces, and civic systems operated with consistency. Their reliability reinforced the idea that the world was being managed, even if no one saw how. Trust did not require understanding. It required continuity. People did not need to know how systems worked as long as they continued to work. The absence of disruption became proof enough. Homes reflected this confidence. Families invested in long-term comforts. Furniture was chosen to last. Neighborhoods were built with the expectation that people would remain. Gardens were planted not for a single season, but for years to come. Children were raised within this framework of assumed continuity. They were taught not only rules and manners, but expectations. Expectations that life would unfold in stages, that effort would lead somewhere, that the future was something to prepare for, not something to fear. This future-oriented mindset depended entirely on the belief that the world itself was stable. Normality made that belief possible. Even when unsettling information appeared, it was often filtered through this lens of assumed stability. A troubling headline, a serious announcement, something that registered briefly, then faded into the background of daily obligations. Life demanded attention elsewhere. Meals still needed to be prepared. Jobs still needed to be done. Children still needed guidance. The practical needs of the present left little room for dwelling on abstract threats. In this way, normal life did not deny uncertainty. It postponed it. The routines of ordinary living allowed people to place anxiety at a distance, not because it was resolved, but because it was not immediately useful. Fear that could not be acted upon was quietly set aside. This was not ignorance. It was adaptation. Human beings cannot live in a constant state of anticipation. To function, they must believe that the ground beneath them is firm enough to stand on, even if only for the moment. Normality provided that ground. The culture itself reinforced this necessity. Everyday messages celebrated progress, growth, and stability. They presented life as orderly and improving. These images did not simply entertain. They reassured. They suggested that the future was not only reachable but familiar. That suggestion mattered, because if the future could be imagined as an extension of the present, then the present felt safe enough to inhabit fully. Normality became more than habit. It became protection. It allowed people to move forward without constantly looking over their shoulders, to invest emotionally and materially in lives that assumed continuation, to find meaning in routines precisely because those routines seemed unbreakable. The illusion was not that danger did not exist. The illusion was that danger belonged somewhere else, outside the home, outside the community, outside the flow of ordinary life. As long as daily routines held their shape, it was easy to believe that whatever threats existed beyond them would remain distant. This belief was fragile even if it did not feel that way. It depended entirely on the appearance of stability, and for a time, that appearance held. Nothing seemed unusual. And that was not an accident. It was how people lived. The presence of fear did not arrive as an interruption. It arrived as an addition. Daily life continued much as it always had, but small instructions began to appear within it. Not urgent, not alarming, simply practical. They were presented as sensible measures, no different from learning how to exit a building during a fire or fastening a seatbelt in a car. In schools, teachers were given new responsibilities. Alongside reading lessons and arithmetic, there were moments set aside for preparation. These moments were brief, orderly, and calm. Children were told where to stand, how to move, how to wait. The language used was careful, nothing dramatic, nothing frightening. The emphasis was on cooperation and calm behavior. The exercises were framed as part of being prepared, part of growing up in a responsible society. For children, these drills quickly blended into the structure of the school day. They lined up when told. They followed directions. They returned to their desks when it was over. There was no sense that anything extraordinary had occurred. Sirens were tested periodically. Their sound was unfamiliar at first, rising and falling through neighborhoods that were otherwise quiet. People paused to listen. Some stepped outside. Others glanced at clocks or radios. Then the sound stopped. Life resumed. Over time, the sirens became recognizable. Predictable. They no longer startled. They were simply another sound in the environment, like church bells or factory whistles. A reminder, brief and contained. Information entered homes through familiar channels. Radio announcements spoke in measured tones. Television segments explained procedures slowly, often accompanied by reassuring language. Printed materials arrived in mailboxes, written plainly and without urgency. The message was consistent. Be aware. Be prepared. Remain calm. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing implied immediacy. The possibility of danger was acknowledged, but always at a distance. It was something to be considered, not something to dwell on. This approach mattered. By keeping fear controlled, authorities ensured that daily life could continue without disruption. Preparation was integrated into routine, rather than standing apart from it. The effect was subtle. People became accustomed to the idea that extraordinary events required ordinary responses. That preparedness was simply another civic duty, like voting or obeying traffic laws. Fear, in this form, did not feel like fear. It felt like responsibility. At home, families absorbed these messages quietly. Parents read pamphlets, listened to broadcasts, and discussed instructions in practical terms. They talked about plans, not outcomes, about steps, not consequences. Conversations often began with conditional language. If something were to happen, just in case. These phrases softened the subject. They kept it hypothetical, distant, manageable. Children overheard fragments of these discussions. They sensed seriousness without understanding details. The tone mattered more than the content. Adults spoke calmly, which suggested that whatever was being discussed could be handled. And so children learned to accept preparation as normal. Television, increasingly present in living rooms, played a unique role. It brought images and voices directly into the home, bridging the gap between distant events and personal space. News segments were watched carefully, often without commentary. People listened, absorbed, and returned to their routines. The television did not demand action. It offered information, and information delivered steadily gave the impression of control. Radio served a similar purpose. Its constant presence, often left on throughout the day, created a sense of connection. Updates were woven into music and talk, making serious messages feel less intrusive. Fear was never allowed to stand alone. It was always surrounded by familiarity. This integration was intentional, even if it was not consciously recognized by those living through it. By embedding preparation within everyday life, the possibility of catastrophe was made less overwhelming. People were not asked to imagine the unimaginable. They were asked to follow instructions, and instructions could be followed. As a result, the presence of fear did not dismantle normality. It coexisted with it. It settled into the background, becoming part of the landscape of daily living. The grocery store still needed stocking. Children still needed help with homework. Workdays still ended with tired bodies and quiet evenings. Life did not pause for fear. Fear learned to wait. This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the period, not that people were unaware of danger, but that they learned how to live beside it without allowing it to dominate their days. The entry of fear was careful, measured, and incomplete. It did not replace ordinary life. It moved in quietly, took its place, and stayed. And for most people, that was enough to keep going. For children, the world was learned through repetition. They learned when to sit, when to stand, when to listen, when to speak. They learned rules not by questioning them, but by following them. School was a place where structure mattered, where authority felt natural, and where instructions were rarely debated. So when new instructions appeared, they were absorbed the same way. Children were told that certain actions were important, that they needed to practice them, that being prepared was part of being responsible. The words were calm. The tone was reassuring. Nothing suggested danger in the moment. They were asked to move quietly, to stay together, to wait. For many children, these moments felt no different from other drills they had already learned. Fire drills, weather drills, simple exercises meant to keep everyone safe. The idea that these new instructions were connected to something larger, something unseen, was rarely explained, and so it remained abstract. Children crouched beneath desks that smelled of wood and chalk dust. They pressed their backs against walls. They covered their heads as instructed. They waited for the signal that the exercise was over. Some peeked at their friends and smiled. Others took the instructions seriously, concentrating on doing everything exactly right. Teachers watched closely, offering quiet guidance. When it was finished, the desks were righted, books were reopened, and lessons resumed. The transition was seamless. For a child, this mattered more than the content of the exercise. The fact that life continued immediately afterward suggested that whatever had just happened was not something to fear. It was simply another part of the school day. Fear, when it appeared, was subtle. It was not panic. It was not dread. It was a question without words. Children sensed that adults were preparing them for something that could not be fully explained. They noticed the seriousness in a teacher's voice, the way conversation sometimes stopped when children entered a room, the quiet attention given to radio announcements or television broadcasts. These details registered emotionally, not intellectually. A child might not understand what the instructions meant, but they understood that they mattered. That understanding lingered. Some children asked questions, others did not. Many accepted the drills as part of the world they lived in, no different from other rules that governed daily life. They trusted adults to know what they were doing. That trust was powerful. It allowed children to carry the weight of preparation without feeling its full meaning. They learned how to act without being asked to imagine consequences. In this way, fear was softened, but it did not disappear. It settled into memory. Children carried these experiences home, often without comment. They did not always describe what they had practiced or why. It was simply something they had done, like lining up or reciting lessons. At home, they absorbed cues from their families. They noticed when parents spoke quietly, when certain topics were avoided, when radios stayed on longer than usual. Children are observant. They notice patterns. They sense shifts in mood, even when no explanation is offered. Over time, a quiet awareness formed. The world was not entirely predictable. This awareness did not overwhelm childhood. Children still played. They laughed. They argued. They imagined futures filled with familiar dreams. But beneath that playfulness, there was a subtle adjustment. Safety was no longer assumed. It was practiced. The idea that danger could exist without being seen became part of how children understood the world. They learned that preparation mattered even when nothing seemed wrong. This lesson was absorbed gradually, without drama. Teachers rarely spoke of fear. They spoke of responsibility, of listening, of following instructions. These values fit naturally within the structure of school life. As a result, the emotional weight of the situation was distributed slowly, evenly, and quietly. Children were not asked to carry the full burden of uncertainty. They were asked to participate. That participation gave them a sense of control, even if they did not fully understand what they were controlling. It allowed them to feel useful rather than helpless. This mattered deeply. Fear that offers no action is overwhelming. Fear paired with instruction becomes manageable. And so childhood continued. Days were filled with lessons, recess, and routine. Birthdays were celebrated. Seasons changed. Report cards were handed out. Life moved forward in small, ordinary steps. The invisible threat remained invisible. It did not dominate childhood memory. It blended into it. Years later, many adults would recall these drills not as moments of terror, but as moments of seriousness. As times when the world briefly revealed that it was larger and more complex than it appeared. At the time, children did not name this realization. They simply lived it. They learned that safety was something adults worked to maintain, that rules existed for reasons that might not always be explained, that calm behavior mattered, even when circumstances were unclear. These lessons stayed with them, not as fear, as awareness. Childhood, shaped quietly by preparation, moved forward, and life went on. The home had always been a place of retreat. It was where doors could be closed, where the outside world was kept at a distance, where routines offered comfort and familiarity. For many families, it was the one space where life felt most under their control. As quiet preparations became part of public life, the home adapted in subtle ways. There were no dramatic changes at first. Meals were still shared at the same times. Chairs remained in their places. Photographs stayed on walls. Life continued to look the way it always had. But conversations shifted. They happened later in the evening, after children had gone to bed. Voices were lowered. Sentences were carefully chosen. Parents spoke in terms of possibilities rather than certainties. What would we do if? Just in case. It's probably nothing, but these phrases carried weight without alarm. They allowed families to acknowledge uncertainty while keeping it contained. Plans were discussed not as predictions but as precautions. Where to gather, what to bring, how to respond. These discussions were practical, not emotional. They focused on steps, not outcomes. In this way, fear was handled indirectly. It entered the home not as panic, but as planning. Basements and storage spaces were reconsidered. Closets were organized with new purpose. Items were placed where they could be reached quickly, though no one expected they ever would be. These actions were rarely framed as urgent. They were described as sensible, responsible, a way of being prepared without dwelling on what preparation implied. Children, when present, were often only partially included. Parents offered reassurance without detail. They explained enough to encourage cooperation, but not enough to invite fear. Trust flowed downward. Children trusted that adults knew what they were doing. Adults trusted that calm behavior would protect their families emotionally, if nothing else. The home absorbed these dynamics quietly. Radio and television became steady companions, not always watched closely, but rarely turned off. Their presence provided connection. Updates arrived regularly, framed by familiar voices and routines. The tone of these broadcasts mattered. They were measured, careful, and restrained. Serious information was delivered without urgency, allowing listeners to remain composed. The effect was steadying. Even when the news was unsettling, the format suggested control. Someone was paying attention. Someone was managing the situation. This sense of oversight allowed families to continue their lives without constant vigilance. Faith also played a role. For some, religious belief offered a framework for uncertainty. Church services became moments of quiet reflection. Prayers were offered for protection, for peace, for guidance. The language of faith provided comfort without requiring explanation. For others, faith was expressed through routine itself, through the act of maintaining normal life, through cooking meals, caring for children, and keeping the household in order. Both approaches served the same purpose. They restored a sense of meaning. Silence was another form of adaptation. Not every family spoke openly about their concerns. Some chose not to discuss the subject at all. They believed that talking too much about uncertainty would give it power. This silence was not denial. It was a boundary. By limiting discussion, families preserved a sense of normal life within their walls. They protected children from anxiety. They protected themselves from imagining outcomes they could not control. In many homes, this unspoken agreement held. Life continued through habit. Laundry was done. Homework was checked. Evenings were spent reading, listening to music, or watching television. These ordinary activities carried new significance. They became acts of stability. Moments of togetherness were valued not because they were rare, but because they felt grounding. The home became a place where the outside world was acknowledged, but not allowed to dominate. Tension existed, but it was managed. It lived in quiet glances, in unfinished sentences, in the careful tone adults used when certain topics arose. It did not disrupt daily life. It underlined it. Families learned how to live with uncertainty without naming it. They learned how to prepare without expecting, how to remain calm without understanding everything. This balance required effort. It depended on trust, routine, and restraint. And for the most part, it worked. The home remained a space of shelter, not just physically but emotionally. A place where life could continue in familiar ways, even as the wider world felt less predictable. Fear did not take over the household. It was folded into it, carefully, quietly. And life inside those walls went on. Over time, what had once felt unsettling began to feel familiar. The drills continued. The instructions remained. The reminders appeared at intervals, steady and predictable. None of it disappeared, but none of it escalated either. It simply stayed. And because it stayed, it settled. Human beings have a remarkable ability to adapt to conditions that would otherwise be unbearable. When uncertainty cannot be removed, it is absorbed. When fear cannot be resolved, it is reshaped into something quieter. In daily life, this process happens slowly. What was once discussed cautiously became routine. What was once practiced with seriousness became procedural. People remembered where to go, what to do, how to respond, without needing to think about it deeply. Preparation became habit, and habit softened the emotional weight of what was being prepared for. People continued to wake up each morning and carry out their responsibilities. They went to work. They cared for their families. They planned birthdays, holidays, and futures. They made long-term decisions that assumed time would continue. This was not denial. It was necessity. Life could not be paused indefinitely in anticipation of something that might never happen. To stop planning would have meant surrendering the present to fear. And so people did what humans have always done under uncertainty. They carried on. The mind learned how to hold two ideas at once, that life was fragile, and that life was worth living fully anyway. This balance required quiet effort. It was maintained through routine, repetition, and focus on the immediate. People concentrated on what could be done rather than what could not be controlled. Work provided structure. Jobs demanded attention, deadlines, and cooperation. In focusing on tasks, people found relief from abstract fears. Productivity became grounding. Raising children demanded even more focus. Children required consistency. They needed to feel safe, to believe in the future, to trust the adults around them. Parents understood this instinctively, so they modeled calm. They continued traditions. They celebrated milestones. They encouraged dreams that extended years ahead. In doing so, they reinforced the idea that the future was not only possible, but expected. Fear was present, but it was not allowed to dominate. It existed alongside hope. This coexistence reshaped emotional life. People became skilled at compartmentalization. They learned when to pay attention and when to set concern aside. They learned how to engage with serious information without allowing it to overwhelm them. This skill was not taught explicitly. It was learned through living. Conversations reflected this shift. What once might have caused alarm now prompted brief acknowledgement and then a return to other matters. The tone remained measured. Emotional extremes were avoided. The extraordinary became ordinary. The idea that something unthinkable could occur did not disappear, but it no longer disrupted daily functioning. It became one possibility among many, rather than the central focus of thought. This normalization had consequences. On one hand, it allowed society to function. Communities continued to grow. Work continued. Families thrived. The economy moved forward. Culture developed. On the other hand, it required emotional restraint. People learned how to live with a background awareness of risk without expressing it openly. They learned how to carry uncertainty quietly. This restraint shaped behavior. People valued stability deeply. They appreciated routine. They found comfort in familiarity. Small disruptions felt more significant because they threatened the delicate balance that kept fear contained. Normal life became precious, not because it was perfect, but because it represented continuity. The act of living ordinarily became in itself an achievement. People planned for the future not because they were certain it would arrive, but because planning affirmed their belief that it should. Making plans became a statement of confidence. Children absorbed this mindset. They grew up in a world where preparation was normal, but so was optimism. They learned that life could be uncertain without being paralyzing. They learned that fear did not have to stop forward motion. This lesson stayed with them. Years later, many would struggle to articulate how they had lived with such awareness. At the time, it did not feel extraordinary. It felt like life. That is perhaps the most revealing aspect of this period. The unthinkable did not dominate the imagination. It was integrated into it. People did not live in constant anticipation. They lived in careful balance. They adjusted expectations without abandoning them. They acknowledged risk without surrendering hope. The world did not feel safe in an absolute sense, but it felt livable. And that distinction mattered. Because livable meant meaningful. It meant that love, work, and community still had value. That effort still mattered. That the present was worth inhabiting, even if the future was uncertain. This normalization did not erase fear. It placed it in the background, where it remained. Life, shaped by this quiet adaptation, moved forward, not untouched, but unbroken. At the same time that uncertainty settled into the background of daily life, something else was unfolding in plain sight. Life appeared to improve. Homes grew more comfortable. Kitchens filled with new conveniences. Living rooms became places not only for rest, but for gathering, entertainment, and connection. Streets expanded. Neighborhoods grew. Stores offered abundance, choice, and promise. The material world suggested progress. People worked hard, and their efforts seemed to lead somewhere. Wages supported families. Communities invested in schools, roads, and public spaces. There was a visible sense of building, of forward movement, of confidence expressed through action. This outward prosperity stood beside an inward awareness. It was not discussed openly. It did not need to be. It was simply understood. Life was improving, and life could be disrupted. These two ideas did not cancel each other out. They existed together. Optimism was not blind. It was practical. People chose to focus on what they could touch, what they could shape, what they could improve. The immediate world felt manageable, even if the larger one did not. Consumption reflected this mindset. People bought furniture meant to last. They invested in homes and neighborhoods. They planned vacations, celebrations, and futures that assumed continuity. These choices were not acts of denial. They were acts of belief. Belief that life should be lived fully, even in the presence of uncertainty. That progress was still worth pursuing. That comfort and meaning were not frivolous but necessary. Advertisements reinforced this outlook. They depicted families at ease, homes filled with warmth, and futures that felt secure. These images were not meant to deceive. They mirrored the life people wanted to believe in, and in many ways, the life they were already living. The contradiction was subtle. Prosperity did not erase awareness. Awareness did not prevent prosperity. They moved alongside each other, shaping behavior without overt conflict. People did not see themselves as living in contradiction. They saw themselves as living normally. The presence of risk did not negate the value of comfort. If anything, it heightened it. Moments of ease were appreciated precisely because they felt fragile, even if that fragility was never spoken aloud. Normal pleasures took on quiet significance. A shared meal, a peaceful evening, a familiar routine. These moments were not dramatic, but they were grounding. Communities reflected this balance as well. Public events continued. Celebrations were held. Traditions were maintained. Schools held ceremonies. Churches gathered congregations. Local life carried on with visible confidence. At the same time, preparation remained. Drills continued. Instructions remained available. The infrastructure of readiness stayed in place, unobtrusive but present. It did not intrude on daily enjoyment. It coexisted with it. This coexistence required emotional discipline. People learned how to keep awareness from becoming obsession. They learned how to acknowledge uncertainty without allowing it to overshadow daily life. This discipline was rarely articulated. It was modeled. Children learned it by watching adults. Adults learned it by necessity. The contradiction became internalized. Life felt good. Life felt uncertain. Both were true. Rather than resolving this tension, people lived within it. They accepted that security was not absolute, but they also accepted that joy did not require absolute security to exist. This acceptance shaped culture. Stories, entertainment, and shared experiences often emphasized resilience, family, and continuity. They reinforced the idea that life, even when complicated, was worth engaging with fully. There was no sense of irony in this, no suggestion that comfort was naive or irresponsible. It was simply human. To seek stability, to build, to hope. The contradiction was not a flaw. It was a feature of survival. By holding prosperity and threat in balance, people avoided extremes. They neither surrendered to fear nor ignored it completely. They found a middle ground that allowed society to function. This balance did not eliminate anxiety. It contained it. The visible success of daily life gave people something to hold on to, something tangible that affirmed effort and meaning, something that made abstract dangers feel distant enough to live with. In this way, the contradiction became sustainable. Life continued to improve in many visible ways, even as uncertainty remained part of the emotional landscape. People did not resolve the tension. They lived with it. And in doing so, they demonstrated something quietly remarkable. They showed that normal life could persist even under conditions that, on the surface, seemed incompatible with it. The streets remained busy, homes remained filled, communities remained connected, prosperity and awareness moved forward together. Not comfortably, but steadily. The end did not arrive with a clear moment. There was no single day when people woke up and felt that everything had changed. No announcement that closed a chapter. No sound that marked a final turning point. Instead, things slowly became quieter. Some routines faded. Drills were practiced less often. Sirens were tested less frequently. Instructions that had once felt essential became less visible, then less discussed. Life adjusted again. But the absence of constant reminders did not mean that what came before was erased. It simply moved deeper into memory, where experiences often go when they are no longer needed every day, but are not forgotten either. The fear did not vanish. It changed its shape. For many, it became a background awareness rather than an active concern, a sense that the world could change suddenly, even if it had not. A recognition that stability was something maintained, not guaranteed. People who had lived through those years carried this understanding quietly. It showed in how they planned, how they worried, how they valued ordinary moments. They did not always speak about it. They did not need to. The habits remained. A preference for preparedness, an appreciation for routine, a tendency to listen carefully when serious information was shared. These were not dramatic traits. They were subtle, almost invisible, but they shaped how people moved through the world. Families continued to gather. Children grew older. Homes changed hands. Neighborhoods evolved. New concerns replaced old ones, each bringing its own uncertainties. The world did not become simple. It never does. What remained was the memory of living through a time when the future felt uncertain in a specific way. A time when ordinary life carried an extra layer of meaning, even if it was not named. For some, that memory was distant. For others, it remained close. But in either case, it influenced how they understood stability. Stability was no longer assumed. It was appreciated. People who had learned to live with an invisible threat often carried a deeper respect for the present moment, not because they lived in fear, but because they understood how fragile normal life could be. This understanding did not make them pessimistic. It made them attentive. They noticed small things, quiet evenings, familiar routines, the comfort of knowing where one belonged. These details mattered more when one had experienced uncertainty without spectacle. Life continued to be lived in kitchens, classrooms, churches, and living rooms, the same spaces where it had always unfolded. The difference was not visible from the outside. It lived inside people, in how they listened, in how they planned, in how they accepted that not everything could be controlled. The era ended not with relief, but with adjustment. And adjustment became normal once again. New generations grew up without the same routines, without the same drills, without the same background awareness. But they inherited something nonetheless. They inherited a quiet cultural memory, a way of understanding that ordinary life can carry unseen weight, that people are capable of adapting without losing themselves, that fear does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lives alongside breakfast tables and school bells. Sometimes it leaves without ceremony. The people who lived through that time did not see themselves as remarkable. They did not believe they had done anything extraordinary. They had gone to work. They had raised children. They had planned for the future. They had lived. And perhaps that is what stands out most clearly in memory. Not the fear itself, not the preparations, not the uncertainty, but the persistence of ordinary life. The way people continued to show up each day, to care for one another, to invest in homes, communities, and futures even when certainty was incomplete. The era did not conclude with answers. It concluded with continuity. A street at dusk, a light in a window, a family gathered quietly in a familiar room. Life went on, and that may be the most remarkable part of the story.